Hi, welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. It is Wednesday, January 29th, and I'm Jessica Steinberg. I'm speaking today with U.S. Bureau Chief Jacob Magid. Hi, Jacob. Good morning.
Hi, Jessica. Good to be with you.
Good to have you here. It is day 482 of the war. U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff landed in Israel for talks after his trip to Saudi Arabia, and President Donald Trump invites Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to visit the White House. That visit appears to be set for February 4th. We'll talk about Trump's first week in office, including the many decisions made that could affect the Middle East and Israel, and some looking back at the Biden administration as they talk about the last months of its term. Okay, so Jacob, let's first talk about Trump's first week in office. He was getting a lot done. First, we have Steve Witkoff, who now has landed. Tell us, and of course, there's been many comments by the hostage families about President Trump, about Steve Witkoff, thanking them for everything that they did for those released hostages. Tell us what you're hearing and reporting about Steve Witkoff in this first week alone.
So I would say he was probably a favorite amongst the hostage families, given the work he was able to do to get this deal across the finish line. And he's looking to take that momentum with him into trying to get past the first phase and into the second phase, because that's likely going to be arguably a bigger challenge. And he's talked about a little bit with the hostage family, something interesting. He himself has lost a child, and he is somehow, I guess, framed this fight for the hostages as if it's a fight for his own child. And I think that's something that's very much moved the hostage families, and also, I guess, that gives them motivation and hope that he will stick leaning on the parties, both Israel and Hamas, to try to accept the compromises that are going to be necessary in order to get past this first phase. And that's what I guess the motivation he's taking with him. It brought him to Saudi Arabia, where he held meetings with the Crown Prince on Tuesday, and he's expecting to try to use Saudi support to entice Israel, I guess, with the normalization deal that's going to be really definitely dangled in front of Israel over these next few months and maybe possibly longer. But first, you really need to make sure this deal holds, because that's been a clear condition that Saudi Arabia has had. If it wants to normalize ties with Israel, it needs the war to end, and it needs Israel to agree to a Palestinian component of this deal, some sort of pathway, irreversible pathway to a Palestinian state. And that's going to be something that's very difficult with this government or any government after October 7th. But I think that's the message he was told when he was in Riyadh. And he's going to probably bring that message also to Jerusalem when he meets with Netanyahu today, and several other Israeli officials. That's on the Witkoff front, I would say.
So, right. Okay, so now let's move back to Trump and some of the other statements that he's made, discussions. Let's start with moving his comment, seemingly offhand, about moving the Gazans to other countries, to other Arab countries. And that, of course, has created quite a chain of reactions. Take us through that a little bit, because we're, in a sense, still in that set of comments.
Right. These were comments Trump made to reporters several days ago, and really quite caught everyone off guard. He had been talking a little bit about how Gaza has become this just destruction zone that needs to be cleaned up. But he hadn't in the past talked about trying to move Palestinians out of Gaza. That had been something that, at least publicly, hadn't been discussed. If I would note that there was an NBC News report a couple weeks ago that talked about maybe, in order to get the reconstruction done, that you do need to move Palestinians out of Gaza, to at least for a temporary amount of time, and that the U.S. was considering Indonesia as one of the countries that maybe the Palestinians could be moved to. And I guess the notion is that this is a Muslim country, it's far away from the region, doesn't have the baggage that other countries nearby have, and that they could be an interesting solution. And I guess the speculation about Indonesia further escalated when you had one of Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State, one of his first calls that he held was with the foreign minister of Indonesia. And even in the readout the State Department issued, They made a point of mentioning that we appreciate Indonesia's efforts regarding the reconstruction and post-war period in Gaza. And maybe that the assumption that one could make after the initial report is that, okay, they're really talking seriously to Indonesia about this idea. So that was where maybe things were heading, let alone the idea that I don't think Palestinians are interested in moving into to Indonesia.
Right.
That's, I don't think, necessarily what they're concerned about, but that is why I think it was such a bombshell when Trump talked about Egypt and Jordan, because these are two countries that view the potential of hundreds of thousands, if not more, Palestinians into their territory as real existential threats that will harm their security. There's all sorts of reasons that these two countries have argued for not taking in Palestinians, especially in Egypt, when I think it really could have saved a lot of lives, probably in the beginning of the war. Egypt refused and argued that doing this will just push the Palestinian issue to another place. It doesn't really solve it. It actually intensifies it. And they did end up taking in 100,000 or so Palestinians throughout the war, but paying exorbitant fees to get in. I think the government really made a lot of money off of it, but also not really giving them citizenship or recognizing them as refugees by any means. And they're really seen as second-class citizens in Egypt. So the idea, I think, that Palestinians will move there, I don't think is very enticing to many Palestinians at this point, even though the elite were the ones that went there who could afford it before. So even they're thinking this is not what they would want. And you saw both countries publicly come out against it. I think they're trying not to be too combative because they know they don't want to cross Trump the way maybe Colombia did, and saw all these sanctions overnight within minutes, I guess you could say, that were put against them. So I think they're trying to maybe quietly send some messaging to the Trump administration explaining their case and why they don't think this is a good idea. But it's going to be tough. It's going to be tough if Trump decides to double down, which is what he did on Monday, again, talking about how he wanted to move forward with this, that he talked to the King of Jordan and that he talked to also the president of Egypt, which was something that caught the Egyptians off guard because there had not been any call between Trump and Sisi. And again, this was something they're trying to not embarrass the president. I think maybe he had been confused by the question regarding whether he talked to Sisi, and he, for some reason, said he had. When he was asked how Sisi responded to this idea, he basically said, well, he believes in peace in the Middle East. So a non-answer could have been attributed to the fact that he didn't want to get into it or to the fact that there was never a call. So a very bizarre interaction that had the Egyptians confused. And I think even in the White House, there had been some confusion why Trump made those comments. They're trying to maybe sort that out privately, but it doesn't seem to be something that's going to go away. And it clearly is something I don't think necessarily that Trump thought of on his own. It seems to be, now that we talked about before the election, it was just him and Witkoff dealing with these issues. Now he's starting to be surrounded by a much larger group of advisors, and some of them maybe who support the ideas that are coming out of Israel, and Netanyahu and his coalition partners who have been talking about this for a long time and who really praised Trump for making these comments. And clearly they're having an impact. And it'll be a question of whether those advisors or one advisor that's pushing this idea of having Egypt and Jordan take in Palestinians, whether those will be the people he listens to, or will the pushback that he gets and some of the quiet diplomacy that Cairo and Amman are trying to do will actually win the day, and they'll look either elsewhere or just simply accept that the Palestinians, for the most part, aren't interested in moving, and even there aren't just enough country, or isn't a country available that's really interested in taking them.
Right. So now let's see what happens with that February 4th visit for Netanyahu. In the meantime, we're going to take a quick break. And when we're back, we'll talk about your interview with Barbara Leaf, top Middle East diplomat. So stay with us.
We, the Holocaust survivors, are a rapidly diminishing group. We are in the last moments of being able to share with our young people our first-hand testimonies. Time is rapidly running out. Each year sees smaller numbers of survivors able to accompany students on the March of the Living. Marching with students and survivors from many countries in those terrible places allows our students to learn and understand through stories and eyewitness accounts about our resilience, our strength, and our determination.
This Yom HaShoah, the Jewish Holocaust Remembrance Day, many survivors like Ava want to march at the International March of the Living in Auschwitz. They need your help. To sponsor a survivor on the March of the Living, go to motl.org.
And one of the things that you also did this week was this interview, sort of outgoing interview with Barbara Leaf, top Middle East diplomat. She discusses a lot of things, including her greatest regret that Hamas was left as a ruling force in Gaza, which of course led to a lot of other things. But tell us about the conversation. You know, I'm curious about her tone and you know, how she really does look back on this period of her work.
This interview we talked, I think it was a couple weeks ago. So just 2 days before the ceasefire hostage deal was announced, it was already clear that we were heading in that direction, but it wasn't over the finish line. And Barbara Leaf, who served as the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern Affairs, so basically the top Middle Eastern diplomat in the State Department, and she's been in the government for decades, in various different roles, a lot of them relating to the Middle East, but she's actually retiring now, or she has already entered retirement at the end of the Biden administration. So there was a lot to reflect on. We focused really on the last 4 years, of course, and chiefly on the war. And as you mentioned, there were some regrets that she talked about, and I think the most chiefly among them was this issue about a lack of plan for the day after, that we had managed to take apart Gaza and dismantle Hamas's military infrastructure, but we haven't really figured out how to put Gaza back together. And I think that is her biggest regret, that she wasn't able to, or the Biden administration hadn't been able to convince the Israeli government to try to plan for the so-called day after, the post-war management of Gaza. And I think it ties to the fact of why, for many, the hostage deal has been somewhat bittersweet, beyond the fact of we have obviously these hundreds, thousands of Palestinian security prisoners, some of them the most egregious offenders that were in Israeli jails that are now being released. Of course, that's one aspect of it, but I think how Barbara Leaf described it, there's this other aspect that reason it's so bittersweet is because we're seeing in these hostage releases a Hamas presence in Gaza. And yes, you can zoom out of the Al Jazeera frame that shows as if there's everyone in Gaza is Hamas right now, because the way that they took those photos and the videos of the hostage releases where there's these mass crowds around them, of the hostages, when it's only several hundred people. I think that is important to know, but it is undeniable that there's just nobody else right now in Gaza to try to even pose as an alternative to Hamas, because there was none that was ever stood up. That Netanyahu felt adamantly so that there could not be any planning for the day after until there was no more Hamas. The U.S. tried to argue that this was the mistake that the U.S. made when it was invading Iraq and Afghanistan and trying to deal with insurgencies there, that if you don't plan ahead of time, you are going to be wasting massive resources and end up in the same places that you were before, with Hamas or whatever insurgency group existing, basically just hiding out or returning to areas that were previously cleared of those fighters because there's nobody there to replace them. And the U.S. had pushed, and Barbara Leaf talks about that in this interview, about the need to try to incorporate the Palestinian Authority, because there was a recognition that basically there's no other alternative. You need to have Palestinian governance. It was something that even Netanyahu and his advisors recognized, that it couldn't be Israel itself. It shouldn't be Israel occupying Gaza after the war. And instead of trying to work with the PA, that Israel talked about, it can't be Abbas and it can't be Hamas. And that basically left this unclear description of Palestinians who were neither, which isn't really anyone. And they basically just stalled, I think, largely because of, at least Barbara Leaf talked about, were political influences in the government in Israel, that you had these far-right coalition partners in Ben-Gvir and Smotrich who threatened to collapse the government if there was any role for the Palestinian Authority. And why the feeling was that this is such a mistake is because Netanyahu himself talked about the desire to have Arab support, like from the UAE or Saudi Arabia, to help the PA, to help just Israel in the reconstruction process. And those two countries and many others were very clear that they were only coming if the PA was involved, that it needed to be part of a broader pathway to a Palestinian state. And if you try to do it without the PA, we're not going to be willing to take part. That was their clear condition. And that was what the U.S. recommended Israel take forward, but it was never allowed to advance in Israel because of the political considerations that Netanyahu was trying to deal with. That's, I think, at least how Barbara Leaf talked about in the story. So that was her main regret, I would say.
In terms of her overview of where things stand now, all these months later, I mean, obviously well into her term, but in other words, the end of her term, the end of hopefully getting toward the end of this war. What were her thoughts about that?
I tried to push her on how the Biden administration handled the war a little bit more beyond just the fact of post-war governance and day after frustrations, but more about how they chose when and how to pressure Israel and when and how to pressure Hamas. And she echoed this point that Secretary Blinken had made several weeks ago, that they definitely criticized Israel on the humanitarian front plenty, and they felt that they were warranted in doing so. But there was a decision not to publicly blame Israel for what they, at times, being the obstacle in the hostage negotiations several times throughout the process that we've talked about a lot. And the reason for that was the fear that this would really harm Israeli and U.S. deterrence against, that's the way she phrased it, as this issue of deterrence. That if Israel's seen as weak and isolated, then it is more susceptible, and the U.S. is more susceptible by extension to attacks from Iran and its proxies. So that was a strategic decision that was made not to criticize, which I thought was an interesting way to describe it. Recognition after the fact, basically, that Netanyahu was at times an obstacle, but a feeling that they couldn't say that publicly throughout the war without risking the U.S. and Israeli strategic position. So that was interesting. I think the bottom line, when we tried to look a little bit more optimistically about where the region is heading, it was very easy to point to Syria and Lebanon, and she didn't try to take credit for those really positive developments that we're seeing right now, that we have Syria, the fall of Assad, and Lebanon, maybe the distancing possibly of quite obviously the physical distancing of Hezbollah beyond the Litani River, but also the distancing hopefully from the halls of power and the government with this election of a president and a prime minister that aren't clearly aligned with Hezbollah. And the goal, I think her recommendations was to really that you have to keep up with those two developments and not let them be ignored, because they I think could have lots of ripple effects for the region, possibly for other countries that have had to deal with different influences of Iran, like Iraq, and that if these cards are played well in Syria and Lebanon, I think there could be positive reverberations for the entire region.
Interesting. And then finally, let's go for one last bit of sort of lighter news on your front, and really a last bit of news from the Biden administration. I'm sure not the last, but about a shipment of condoms or an order of condoms that was made at some point in the last 16 months. Tell us about that, Jacob.
Basically, you had during this press briefing that the new press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, really impressive figure, 27 years old, the youngest press secretary ever. She's trying to justify the decision that the Trump administration made to put a freeze on all foreign aid, basically, that the U.S. gives, so billions and billions of dollars. This decision was made as part of an executive order that Trump signed on the first day to basically say we want our foreign aid to be in line with our interests, and we feel that it's currently not. America first. So we're going to be reviewing everything. And while we review it, we're going to have a 90-day freeze in order for that to happen. And after this executive order was signed, you had the State Department issue a memo putting a stop work order on all this foreign aid. And basically, the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, according to Leavitt, did some review of some of the spending and came up with this figure of $50 million that the U.S. had been spending during the Biden administration, or had earmarked during the Biden administration to go to condom distribution in the Gaza Strip. quite a damning revelation if the case. But there was no real information provided by Levitt beyond that statement, beyond to just say, look, this is proof that all this money is going for silly programs in Gaza of all places, when it should be going and being spent in America. And this is a preposterous waste of tax money. But when I spoke with a former Biden administration official, Andrew Miller, who served as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Israeli-Palestinian Affairs, he said this is totally outlandish. It's a feverish dream is the phrase he used to deny that this is the case. And he pointed to the funding that had gone in the fiscal year of 2023 towards all contraceptions. So all sorts of male condoms, female condoms, all sorts of various contraceptives. Some of them I had never even heard of. But there's quite a long list, and there is funding that the U.S. gives worldwide for these various contraceptive uses. And the number in the fiscal year of 2023 was 60 million. So the idea that 50 million out of 60 million is going to Gaza from the entire world, when a lot of these kinds of shipments are actually sent to Africa and other countries that have other developing countries that are in need. The idea that the 90% or whatever, the vast majority of it is going to Gaza is nonsense, and there wasn't really any figures used or charts used to show that this was actually the case. I don't expect them to ever actually put something out. But it was, I guess, a humorous attempt by the Trump administration to argue that, look at all the silly funding that the previous administration had been doing. It's very possible that there was lots of frivolous spending in various offices, but I don't think the money was going towards Gaza condoms.
It also might not be the last that we hear of it, so we'll wait and see what happens with that.
Wait till next week.
Possibly. Wait till next week. All right. Thank you, Jacob, for all of this, for letting us know what's going on, for all the highlights. And, of course, that interview with Barbara Leaf will be at the bottom of the podcast. So if you want to read more about it, you'll have that access to that. And it's been good to see you.
Thanks, Jessica.
And thank you. And thanks to you, all of you, for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. We'll be back again tomorrow with another installment. This episode is produced by the Podwaves. Any comments, always feel free to email us, podcast@timesvisual.com. Until next time, have yourselves a good day. Speak to you soon.